Well, hey, I'm James Riley.
And I'm Beth Riley.
And we've got another fun edition of our Artist Spotlight podcast series, one you're going to love. Beth, who we got?
Well, today we have the pleasure of speaking to the sole remaining member of the legendary rock and roll band, the Surfaris, Mr. Bob Berryhill.
Bob, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing great. Thanks for calling, and looks like a great day for an interview.
Absolutely.
Bob, you're one of the original members of the Surfaris, the only original member left. Who were some of your guitar influences starting out?
Well, in junior high is where I really got serious about, and that was 1960. And so probably the Ventures were a big part of it, and Duane Eddy. And then when Dick Dale got started in the early 60s with his Surfer Stomps down in Balboa, he was a great influence. But prior to all that, my parents were into country and Western music, so there were plenty of guitar players that were influential in the early days of my learning to play the guitar.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up. In interviews with Dick Dale and Duane Eddy in the past, both of them talked about the country influence, and sometimes you don't think about country and surf, guitar, rock being that closely related, but they very much are.
Oh, yeah. Country music started putting drums, because the original Grand Ole Opry, they did not have a drum set. It was kind of like, it was acoustic bluegrass. And when they brought in the drums in the late 50s, there was a show out in California called the Town Hall Party, which was like the Grand Ole Opry here in Nashville. It was the same players. And one of the great guitar players that used to come on was Joe Mathis. He was an awesome guitar player. Speedy West, steel guitar player. So there was some great instrumental things that they used to jam on. And my parents would take myself and my sisters to the show, and we'd sit out there in the audience and listen. And I kind of pointed up to my dad and said, "Dad, I want to do that."
Oh, that's great.
Back in the early days. That's back in the late 50s.
Man, now the story of how Wipeout came together, Wipeout being one of the most influential and iconic rock and roll band songs of all time. The story of how that came together is great. And I know you've told this a million times, probably even just this week. I'd love for you to tell it again, how that came about.
Well, when you start out in junior high, all you can do is play fast dance music. And so we got together basically when we were sophomores in high school, September of 1962. Pat Conley called me and said, "Hey, Bob, can we come over? We want to practice." So Jim Fuller and Pat both came over to my house, and we sat around for about 3 hours in my living room practicing, just playing. I was playing all the Ventures and songs like that I had learned, and Jim Fuller was playing all the surf tunes he could think of. And so at the end of the rehearsal, Pat Conley says, "Hey, Bob, we got a gig tonight." And I said, "Really? We don't have a drummer." He says, "Well, we're going to meet the drummer there." So everything with the Surfaris has been kind of like that. The dominoes all had to fall in line, or none of it would have happened. You couldn't miss one of them. But anyway, after we got together and we met Ron Wilson at Pomona Catholic High School, we played our first sock hop, as they called them then, in the gymnasium after a football game. So after we sort of got started, then our manager came along, and Dale Smallin, and he had a studio, a video studio, one of the early videographer type of guys, and photographs, and he would take pictures of people, and he had our band there, and we'd rehearse there. Well, one night, Ron Wilson came in and said, "Hey, Bob, I had a dream about a song called Surfer Joe." Now, remember, the Beach Boys had come out with surfing, and there was all kinds of surfing going on. It wasn't unusual to have that kind of thing happen. So I said, "Okay, Ryan, play it." So we started playing his drums and singing, and I put some chords to it and put together an arrangement. Sounded good. And then Dale Smallin comes in and goes, "Hey, boys, why don't you record that? It sounds like a Beach Boy song." I went, "Oh, that's cool. So let's go to Hollywood." And he goes, "Well, you can't afford that." So he said, "We can go to Cucamonga." Now, everybody knows that that's a joke, right?
Yeah.
But that is the name of a town out in the East Desert heading towards Barstow. There was an old stagecoach stop out there, and it's where they had vineyards and things like that. It's now called Rancho Cucamonga. So anyway, that's where we went to record Surfer Joe, and it was at PAL Studios, which is owned by Paul Buff, who later kind of found out was kind of the father of surf music recording because he was cheap and he was out there in a low rent district and he was a Marine. He built his own studio out of handmade parts. He's an electronics guy, sort of like a Leo Fender kind of a person who created his own recording studio and had it all set up and had recorded several bands out there. In fact, he had recorded the Chantays out there before us and did the early work on their song Pipeline. They never finally recorded it there. They went on to another label, another studio, but he kind of helped put that song together. So he was really good at putting songs together, and he had a hot studio, as we called it in those days. Now, it was a monaural studio, meaning that it was a 2-track, quarter-inch tape affair, and that was basically what you had in December of 1962. And so we got in there, and we set up Ronnie's drums, set up the amps. The bass went direct. Now, the curious thing about the bass is Pat Conley did not have a bass guitar. So he brought his cousin's harmony bass guitar. And so he plugged that directly into the cord, and that went to the board so that you wouldn't have bass in the room. So it was basically a direct, and that's the first time he ever played bass guitar was that night with the band. He's got that plugged in. Jim Fuller had a dual sonic Fender and an amp, and I had my Fender Jazzmaster and my Bandmaster amp. Set all that up, and we recorded Surfer Joe. We did the drums, guitars. Ronnie kind of lip-synced it when we played it. And then when he finished recording the music, he went in by the microphone and he sang Surfer Joe. So we're all standing around in the room after we finished Surfer Joe, and they get on the talkback button, and Dale says, boys, we're only 15 years old. Says, boys, you need a second song for your 45. That just shows you how prepared 15-year-olds are to do anything. They're just kind of, you show up and you do what you have to do. And we said, well, we hadn't written another song. And so he said, well, we can put Surfer Joe on both sides of your 45, or you can write another song. So Ron Wilson, being the dynamic marching band drummer he was, starts playing a cadence. He just wrote on the spot, just started creating it, and that Wipeout beat started happening. And I said, well, we better put some guitars, bass, and rhythm on this thing, or is this going to be a drum solo like Sandy Nelson? Because there were already songs out like that didn't have any music. They just had drum solos. Pat Conley starts going, ba-da-ba-da, which is the surf bass, and he goes, ba-da-da-ba, and Fuller goes, ba-da-da-ba, da-da-da-da-da-da. And I said, okay, I'm going to make a break here. So we put in the drum solos, the breaks, and we got the melody hooked up. We recorded it once. And then they said, you know what, guys, why don't you do it one more time? So we did it a second time. Said, that was pretty good. Why don't you do it one more time for the Gipper? So we plugged in, we did it one more time, and they said, okay, we got it. And so that's how Wipeout was created.
That's amazing.
Now, speaking of Wipeout, it's been covered by everyone from Fish to my personal favorite, the Muppets. I'm just kidding. That's not my favorite.
Hey, I'll tell you what, my granddaughters love it.
But do you have a favorite version of it besides the one that the Surfaris did, of course?
Well, the original one, there's been so many versions. The Beach Boys re-recorded it, guys in Germany, Australia, United States. I've got records from all over the world, you might say, of every country. But I guess the one I love the most is the one that I did again in 2003 with my wife on bass and my son Deven on guitar and my son Joel on drums. And we did another version of Wipeout. It's called the Surfaris Wipeout album. We just released it on our 60th anniversary album. It's on vinyl. It's available on our website. Anybody wants to get a copy. So that's kind of my favorite version. Of course, people always come up and say, hey, can you do the Fat Boys version, which is a rap version? Now, that was interesting because it was the Beach Boys and the Fat Boys did a version of it. And I got a triple platinum album out of that. And so it was pretty cool.
I spent years working at record labels, and probably 98% of the time you're chasing something. The other 2% of the time you sort of luck into something that becomes a hit. Did the record companies have an idea of what they wanted to do with you, or were they just trying to capitalize on something?
Our story is that we recorded Wipeout, the 45 and the Surfer Joe. And, Paul Buff tried to market it himself to some record labels like Art LeBeau, who was a oldies but goodies guy. He passed on it. Took it to Capitol. They passed on it. So it was kind of like several people heard the song. And it wasn't until it was taken down to Richard Delvey of the Challengers, who was working at Merritt Distributing Company. And he was sitting in his desk, and this guy, a distributor, brought in the 45 and played it. And Delvey says, "Hey, that's a hit record." So, he liked it. And he called John Maniscalco, who had worked with Little Richard and had a label called Princess Records. You can look up John. He's on the internet. He passed away recently, about 3 or 4 years ago. But he had a bunch of stuff going. And he said, "Yeah, that's a cool song. Let's put that out." So we put it out on Princess. As a record label, we didn't get onto Dot right away. First of all, Richard Delvey and John Maniscalco mailed the 45 to Johnny Hyde at KYNO in Fresno. So from Hollywood, mailed to Fresno, got on the best song of the night, fan kind of produced show. And by Thursday, it was number one. Then Dot Records called Johnny Hyde and said, "Hey, do you guys have any songs for the week?" Because they knew they were breaking new songs. They said, "Yeah, we do." He mailed it back to Los Angeles, and Dot Records said, "This is a hit song. Let's put it out." And so bang, this is somewhere around February, March of 1963. So we recorded the song in December of 62. By March of 63, we had a recording contract, started to get on some airplay down here. By April, May, June, it was number one in Los Angeles. And then by September, it was like number one in various markets, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Germany, all over the place, Japan, all over the world. So we had kind of a skyrocket beginning.
Something that's kind of interesting over the last few decades of just reading interviews or talking to artists, both classic and new. A lot of them that say that maybe they were into punk music and then they discovered surf music by listening to punk. What do you think it is that is appealing to people that are into punk music about surf music?
Well, it's headbanging music. Let's put it that way. Remember, when we started playing, we only played for dances. We never had a concert where people were sitting down. And so punk music is basically mosh pit music. And whenever they would play it, like, the Wipeouts would play it or Agent Orange would play it, and people would get out there and bounce their heads and elbows off each other. So it's one of those kind of things where it's very energetic kind of music. And punk music is that way as well. Punk was an alternative to heavy metal, because you remember heavy metal with long hair, just noodling crazy stuff. Most audiences want to go back to the simplicity of music. And so when you come out with a type of music like punk, it's a simple, guttural kind of music, and Wipeout surf music fits right into that genre.
In the mid-1960s, you guys started incorporating covers like Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and others. Mm-hmm. Now, the music keeps changing, but great music keeps circling back to the 1960s sound. What do you think it is about that decade that is so iconic?
Well, we started out with the Wipeout album, Wipeout Surfer Joe. Then we did an all-instrumental album with a couple of vocals on it, because Ron Wilson was a singer. And when we would do concerts, because remember, in those days, disc jockeys like Wink Martindale and those kind of guys that were all the disc jockeys in L.A. were putting on concerts all over the area. And the people that we were playing for were listening then. In other words, when 64, 65, 66, they were listening to the Stones and the Beatles. And they really wanted those kind of vocals. So we incorporated those into our set, So when we started recording back in the 60s, we had to kind of incorporate those songs with them. So vocals became part of our set, but we never really did the Beach Boy kind of vocal. We always did more of the, I guess you would call it more punk vocals, which were the Rolling Stones and those kind of things, and some Beatles, but not much. But it was mostly dance types of things where people would want to just really, enjoy the music, and we could play along. And with Ron Wilson being such a dynamic drummer, we could put in extensive drum solos and some really clever beats. In fact, Casey Kasem, we did a show for him out in Thousand Oaks, and we had been experimenting with some offbeat kind of stuff. And Ronnie would sometimes go off beat and start playing all kinds of things. Or we would start a song, we would go off into this sort of a punkish kind of thing, and then we'd come back to the original song. He even mentioned when we got back off the stage, he says, you know what, I've never heard a band go so far off a beat and then come back to the exact beat again. So Casey was really a connoisseur of music like that and really knew the finer points. And so that was quite a compliment from him.
And a little side note, we did want to mention ahead of time, we didn't, and we just heard it, but there is a train directly down from our apartment. So if you hear a train.
Yeah, you know what that's like.
We knew you're in Tennessee, so it give you a little bit of a Johnny Cash feel.
Yeah, it's what it feels like when you have that kind of a beat behind you. Yeah. Or Johnny Be Good, listen to the rhythm that the drivers made.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, Johnny Be Good. We did songs like that as far as vocals.
Now, since about 2000, you've been touring the Surfaris with your wife, Jean, and your sons, Deven, our buddy, and your other son, Joel. Yeah. How cool is that to work with your family?
Well, it was an uphill battle. It is cool. It is outstanding at this point to have my sons and my wife on the stage with me. I mean, I just really love it. One of the things that keeps me going is that they're there with me. But you got to remember when Linda McCartney was playing on stage with Paul, everybody kind of poo-pooed that, like, what are you doing with your wife up there? And my wife and our kids have had to fight that battle because the purists that love surf music only think of guys playing it. And if you bring your kids in, sort of nepotism, they don't like that either. So people have come around, since those 60s, 70s, 80s were like that. And then now you've got bands that like Eddie Van Halen had his son in there, and other people. Glenn Campbell had his kids with him, and so Johnny Cash had his whole family with him. I mean, there are plenty of bands that have had kids with them, and that is kind of like the saying goes. Well, with the four of us when we're on tour, if the gig is a bust, we're on vacation then.
That's a good point.
But it's interesting is that, when you have, a wife and two sons, you have to learn to work together in a professional way. That's a big challenge. It just doesn't happen. We're not the Von Trapp family, where the dad said everything and everybody followed along. It's like my sons are both very independent musicians. They have their own bands. They do their own things. And my wife has her own music, and she's also an author and things like that. So everybody's got their own 2 cents. And so I don't get my way all the time. Let's put it that way. To learn to work with your kids in a professional way is a lot of work, but it's very, very rewarding because I have my granddaughters and great-granddaughters, all coming along at this point with us to come on tour sometimes. And it's so awesome to see them out there. I usually give them something to do like video or run the board or run the product table. We usually have like 1 or 2 hours after the show, just standing at the product table, signing autographs, talking about Wipeout, that kind of thing. So it's just a great family contribution, you might say.
And we weren't going to mention them, but since you have a couple of times, I'll mention the Beach Boys. Mike Love, his son Christian, is a touring member of the Beach Boys now. So
yeah, it's amazing. It's almost like, who do you trust? It's kind of like family and blood is critical. Because there are still financial decisions that have to be made. There's economics that have to be made and decisions. So having your kids with him, like Al Jardine is out there playing. And I think he has Brian Wilson's 2 daughters in his band.
Yeah, that's right.
And we're looking forward to maybe working with him sometime. I've talked to his agent about having the Surfaris and Al Jardine put together. As you know, in 1964, January, February, we toured Australia with the Beach Boys.
That's right, yeah.
And so we, became very close. I mean, Brian Wilson, we were at his house for spaghetti, some nights with his wife, and going to the same studios and in and out. Glenn Campbell, all these people that were coming in and out, the Wrecking Crew guys, they never played on any. Well, at the end, we did incorporate some of the Wrecking Crew guys to help us do the vocals and things. But initially, it was just us 4 and 5 with Jim Pash on sax. And so we had lots of time in between recordings and in between tours to hang out with people like Dick Dale, Chantays, and stuff like that. So we were Lively Ones, other groups like that. So we had lots of commingling with many of them have passed away now, Eddie and the Showmen, but many of them have had their kids in their bands now. And I think it's more acceptable than it used to be, but it's still a challenge. I mean, but what's so great is that when you're creating things like what we did on the 2003 Wipeout album that we produced, we all sat down because if you remember, the original Wipeout album has Wipeout and Surfer Joe, then it has 10 other hits by other instrumental artists, if you look at the fine print.
Yeah.
And we kind of got ripped off on that, and that's how Richard Delby did things. So, but that's all in the past. I mean, again, you got to have the dominoes. And some people have to think they're ripping you off, take music from you and stuff like that for them to invest in it, you might say. And then, fortunately, we had a bunch of good lawyers that got our rights back and our publishing and things. It was all worked out, and Delby and I had a good relationship until his death, and along with John Mariscalco until his death. So we worked out the difficulties. But the 2003 Wipeout album that I did, what I wanted to do was recreate what we would have done if we had been given the chance on the original Wipeout album. We all sit around in a circle and we wrote songs together. And the 8 original songs that go on the Wipeout Surfaris album are original songs written by the 4 of us. And the writer's credits are the 4 of us. Everybody put in their 2 cents. They may have had a song, but we all made it our songs. And we wanted to do it in the same way that Surfaris wrote songs, because we never wrote a song outside of the studio. We went to the studio, we showed up, nobody had anything prepared. We just showed up, plugged in, and started playing.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that's why our thing is called Surfaris Play, our second album, because we just sat there and played. And we just turned the tape player on, and Waikiki Run was created in the studio, See Me Loud, Batman, Surfing Drums, Point Panic. Then we'd flip it over and do Mr. Lou. We did Reword, did Wipeout. And then Ronnie wanted to sing one, so we did I'm a Hog for You, Baby. And then we played Jack the Ripper, wrote another Safari Stomp, and another we wrote called Surf Seed. So, those are how we did it. And so I wanted to recreate that same feel on this Wipeout album that I did. So that's why to me, it's one of the great recreations of an era by the original people who knew what the heck it sounded like.
Oh, absolutely. Surfer Joe, we talked about the song. The artist, Surfer Joe, a quite popular modern surf artist who did some dates with you earlier this year. How was it playing with him out there?
Well, yeah, Lorenzo, he's Italian.
Yeah.
Speaking Italian and everything. And so he's a pretty funny guy. Back about 15 years ago, he called me on the phone and said, "Hey, Bob," in his Italian accent, "I want to use Surfer Joe as the name of my band and stuff." And I said, "I'd like to do that. I need your permission." I said, "Well, that's really a great tribute to Ronnie, because Ronnie passed away in 1989. I said, "That'll be cool." So for the last 15 years or so, he's been doing a Surfer Joe festival in Livorno, Italy. And it's a 4-day event, and it has 30 surf bands from all over the world showing up. So he called and said, "Hey, Bob, I want you to be the headliner for a show in June." That was last June, 2023. And I said, "Okay." So we got on a plane, and, you got to ride for 12 hours to get there. It's a long flight. We landed, and, the show was awesome. He has collected a really eclectic group of people that severely love surf music. I mean, and I got to hear for 4 days all of these surf bands that have sort of progressed the mode, how it sounds. And they have definitely moved on. Like, I only heard, Jimmy Dale was there, and he played Dick Dale music, but everybody else played original stuff. And there's several bands that were on those tour with us that are here in the United States that are playing around. And they play some really dynamic instrumental music with flair, with different acts, different kinds of feeling. I mean, there's Russian surf bands and Italian surf bands, German surf bands, Japanese surf bands, and everybody has their own little twist that they put on the instrument music. It's kind of an amazing thing to be there. And with playing with Surfer Joe, once again, he has created his own Italian surf music, I guess you would call it. And it was great to work with him. And then we came out to California in January, and we did 4 concerts out there, and people loved it. So I think he's a great guy to work with, and we really enjoy touring with him.
And your son, Deven, has another band called the Tourmaliners, one of our favorites here in the Riley household. They're doing that event this year. What is it like to see Deven do that particular band? Are you a fan of them too?
Oh, yeah. When you have your son out there working his tail off to create his own version of surf music. And of course, remember that when he was first born, we would listen to surf music on the stereo, and he would sit there and pound on the stereo with his fists, and then I bought him a little baby drum set, and then I finally got him a guitar and watched him create and grow. And he played surf music for his junior high. There's a picture of his first Mustang electric Fender guitar, and I've been watching him, generate things, and he's had several different versions of his surf music, and he's really refined it now. So it's a pleasure to watch him recreate a sound that we created, and he's just sort of keeping it tapped into it and is really working it. I mean, he got favorite band or something in San Diego last year, and he's up for another one this year. It's fun to watch somebody recreate something that is such energetic and he loves a lot. So it's great.
You'll be happy to know that I talked to him a couple of years ago, kind of doing the same thing that we're doing now. Yeah. I asked him, just being funny, so would you rather just play for the Tourmaliners or the Surfaris? And then started laughing. He's like, I can't pick.
Well, it's a situation where he's created his own thing. Any time you have somebody like, let's say me, who's, let's say a legend in the surf music genre, and he plays for me because I really need somebody who knows the music thoroughly inside and out, and he does. So it makes the rhythm guitar, and when he takes over lead, and then we do a dueling lead, we really click together. Now, and I run the show, so it's my band, so he has to follow my direction. He doesn't like that, but he tries to follow. And then when he gets his own band, he gets to lead it the way he wants to. He's good at separating out that. We're doing one right now where we're going to be playing in July 14th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so Deven handles the tech stuff. So he calls them and works out getting amps and all of that for us. So we work together really well. He loves to create his own thing. I mean, Deven's really out in front kind of person. I really enjoy watching him do that. When he plays with me, I want him to be out in front and work hard to make the music what I think it should be, which is exciting. So it all works together.
Another cool festival coming up July 26th through 28th is the Surf Guitar 101 Festival Weekender, and the Surfaris are going to be part of that. A lot of other 80s, 90s bands reuniting there too, a lot of modern bands. That's going to be cool that you guys are part of that. Yeah.
Well, after doing the Lorenzo Surfer Joe Festival, that put us kind of in the queue to get to play the Surf 101 group. And of course, with the other guys already passing away, I'm sort of the last man standing. And so looking forward to it. It's going to be at the Golden Sails Hotel in Long Beach, which is right on Pacific Coast Highway, not far from Seal Beach, where we used to live, and up down the road from Huntington Beach. So it'll be a great opportunity to hook up with people that have been around surf music and love to talk about surf music, probably do a kind of a question and answer period or whatever thing goes on like that. So it'll be fun to reminisce about the old days and the new days and talk about music. So it'll be a great time.
I want to backtrack a little bit because I left out poor Joel. Let's talk about Joel because we don't know too much about him. We know a lot about Deven because, we're fans of the Tourmaliners, but we're fans of Joel too. So tell us about your other boy.
Well, Joel is a born comedian. Back when he was a kid, he used to memorize routines from various comedians of the day, and he'd stand in front of us and talk like that and make us laugh. He's really loves to laugh and is really a sweet guy. Of course, he does Surfin' Bird in our set, which only a certain person can do that song. And in fact, we're going to play in Minnesota with the Trash Men who did Surfin' Bird.
That's
so
great.
It's going to be interesting. Yeah, that's going to be really exciting to play with a band that we played their song as a main focus in one part of our set. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But he plays drums, bass guitar. He's not a lead guitarist, but he plays good rhythm guitar. He's a singer. He's also into computers and does software programming and sort of like he's doing things where you, like a business analyst, he does those kinds of things. His wife, Melody, and they've got 2 daughters, Faith and Selah. They're both sophomores in high school here in Nashville. And Selah created the first women's wrestling team at Station Camp High School. And she has started wrestling. It's crazy. But anyway, she's doing that. And the other daughter is into computers. She wants to be a computer software engineer. So he's got a really full-time life trying to get 2 15-year-olds through high school. But he's a hard worker, very energetic. Like I said, one of the things I told Joe was when you're drumming, think Ron Wilson. Whatever you think Ronnie would do. And Joel is very much a research analyst. So he actually took all of my old albums and listened to the riffs and the snaps and the paradiddles and all the stuff the drummers do, listen to Ronnie so he can recreate that in our set. And what's interesting is, like, we played down in Capistrano in California at an outdoor event at the Mission San Juan. It was outside. And we just finished doing our sound check. And I walked back to the back of the area, and there was a lady there who was part of the custodial team, and she goes, that sounds like the Surfaris. Nobody knew who we were until we got playing. So that's what I'm looking for. People hear us and they hear the original band. And so Joel has tried to do that with his drumming. I do that obviously with my guitar, and Deven also works on the rhythms and the leads that Fuller and I all played. My wife copies Pat Conley, the best she can with the way she plays. So we're basically a carbon copy of the original band. And I think people appreciate that.
That's awesome. One thing we like to do for each of our radio shows is a request, and wanted to get a request for you for Catching a Wave, which is mostly surf. It's a little bit of garage and anything else we want to put in there. Do you have a request for really any kind of surf song? It could be the Surfaris. We play a lot of Surfaris. Dick Dale, Shantays, anything. Is there a request of anything that you'd like to hear?
Well, I love to hear Pipeline and Miserlou played because it's so definitive. In other words, the Surfaris Wipeout, Miserlou by Dick Dale, Shantays, Pipeline, those kinds of things, Surf Rider, Penetration. Those original tunes that led the era. I love to hear those.
Man, those never get old.
And my show is called Boppin' with Beth, and it is multi-genre. So about the only thing I won't play is rap and hip hop. So no Fat Boys on this one.
Exactly.
But if you have a request, and I will say, I have a segment on the show called Hang 10 with none other than Jammin' James Riley sitting right here.
Howdy.
The music bed for it is the Surfaris Wipeout. So,
well, I love Rick Nelson, Traveling Man, those kind of things. Sitting in front of the TV, watching, seeing or hearing him sing and stuff like that. So I like those songs from those TV shows.
Okay. And kind of along the same lines a little bit, we like to ask everybody that we talk to, if you were stranded on a desert island and you could take 3 to 5 albums with you, what 3 to 5 albums would you pick to take with you?
Well, I'd probably bring the Wipeout album, the Surfaris Wipeout original album. I like a band that you may have heard of. It's called Dada. Ever heard of that band?
No. Well, the name sounds familiar. When was that?
Dada. They're from the 80s.
Okay.
They're a really good brother act. They've got an album called American Highway Flower. Is one of their songs, I believe. I like that band a lot. Oh, I even like, Van Halen, Volume 1. That would be a good one to bring. Kind of right. And also Stevie Ray Vaughan, Double Trouble album is great. And then when I'm in a sort of a bluesy mood, I probably go for some of the early stuff in those early days, the early 50s kind of blues that was really undiscovered for many, many years. Muddy Waters and those kind of guys that were, playing stuff that you'd never hear on American radio. You'd hear it only on the radio in the South, you might say.
Sure.
Or that kind of stuff,
You mentioned Van Halen. I have to imagine Eddie Van Halen was inspired somewhat of surf music. I've never read an interview about that, but I have to imagine that had some type of influence on him.
Well, yeah, there's a story. I mean, Van Halen is from the Glendora area that we grew up in, and Eddie wanted to be a drummer, as the story goes. And his brother asked him, okay, Eddie, play Wipeout. Well, Eddie couldn't play Wipeout on the drums. That's how he quit playing drums and picked up the guitar. So it's kind of a strange story. Without Wipeout, Eddie Van Halen wouldn't be the guitar player that he is or was.
That's pretty cool.
I think it's in one of the stories that they tell or one of the websites. Yeah, so Wipeout was sort of the dividing line. And another guy, the Boss, I mean, he did a one-man show in New York. And he got up on stage and he goes, hey, I used to choose my drummers. If they could play Wipeout, I'd put them in the band.
Oh, that's great.
So because he said that it came up every time they played a show that if the audience would yell, play Wipeout. And if the drummer couldn't play it, it was really bad. But he had to have one that could play that.
We judge record stores on their selection of Surfaris albums, by the way. So if they've got a good selection, then that's a good record store. Yeah.
Well, we'll have to get them to put our 60th anniversary album. I printed those out, a special, and I think there's about 15 of them left. We need to get them into the used historic bookstores or record stores anyway.
We were just listening to the vinyl of that earlier, actually.
Oh, yeah. It worked out good. I mean, people really liked that. I would be taking a bunch of them to California with me for fans to get autographs and sign and have a good time with.
An artist I want to ask you about, and you can be honest if you don't like them. It won't hurt my feelings. It'll end the call quickly, but I'm kidding. I'm just kidding.
Sure.
But are you a fan of Jackson Browne?
Oh, yeah. Jackson Browne, doesn't he have a club in Chicago or San Francisco? I believe he does. I went to his club, and he has a band up there. He came up and sang for us. So, yeah, I like his original stuff that he did years ago.
Okay, then you're safe.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's interesting is that when you have a singer that has a style that's not like anybody else's, Elvis, you can name them, Roy Orbison, you know them instantly when you hear their song. That's who that is. They're an original thing. And it's just like Ron Wilson on Wipeout. You know it initially because that's the talent that it took to do it. So I like those kind of vocalists that have their own style.
Well, you mentioned Ricky Nelson earlier. It would be easy for someone to think of him as an Elvis copy or something, but he wasn't that at all. He definitely had his own style. Definitely a big fan of Ricky Nelson.
Oh, yeah. Rick had his own, he obviously with his dad being a producer of a TV show and his brother Dave and Harriet, they all kind of came up together. It's a family, and so for me, watching a family doing their thing is awesome because they each have their own personalities, but they're still a family and they pull together and work together very well. So I think that was always great about Sue and Rick.
Well, Bob, we want to thank you so much for taking the time out to chat with us today. It has been a real pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you so much for doing the interview and hope to see everybody out there on the road.